Good day, mates. Today is Australian National Day. To celebrate this monumental day, I made a history of Australia. So we're not crack up in a codie, mate, because this will be a flat-out history video, and I reckon you'll enjoy it. So without further ado, here's my gnarly history of the land down under, which contains this, and ooh! All of these things can be found in the land we call Australia. Enjoy. Ah, Australia, you're so crazy. Where did you come from? Well, let's find out. The land we call Australia can trace its roots 42,000 years ago to 40,000 BCE. This is the time where Australia's first inhabitants, Homo sapien hunter-gatherers, lived, including two special ones. In 1974, near Lake Mungo in New South Wales, a series of 3 skeletons were found, including the so-called Mungo Man. These skeletons were found to be 42,000 years old, and these remains gave researchers an important window into what the lives of Australia's prehistoric Aboriginal people looked like. By the way, if you don't know, Aboriginals are the natives of Australia before the Europeans. So yeah, that was a pretty important discovery in 1974. Around 15,000 years ago, rising sea levels caused Tasmania to become an island, as it used to be connected to the Australian mainland. Yeah, I know that all Australians, or a lot of them, think that all Tasmanians are like hairy bogans, but I doubt that. Around 3,300 years later, 11,700 years ago, mainland Australia was disconnected from the island of New Guinea, which is currently today split between Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, who has a lot of internal issues there. So yeah, essentially rising sea levels a very long time ago caused Tasmania and New Guinea to be like, Australia, it's not us, it's you. And then Australia said, but why? Then Tasmania and New Guinea can be like, we're ditching this joint. Anyways, nothing really happened in Australia for the next 9,000 years or so. From maybe up to 1,000 years ago, people from Africa and Asia possibly traded with the Aboriginal people of Australia. Research into this is ongoing, as well as into a few other people at this place. On February 26, 1606, Dutch explorer Willem Janszoon of Amsterdam on his ship, the I don't know how to pronounce it. It's spelled Duyfken. If someone can help me pronounce that, that'd be impressive. Anyways, this Dutch guy arrived in what's now Vipa, or the town of Vipa, on Cape York of Queensland, which is in the northeast of Australia. Willem Janszoon became the first European on the Australian mainland. He then mapped a bit of Cape York, but however, after finding the land to be beautifully elegant, getting ambushed by Aboriginals and losing a bit of his crew, surviving, and then seeing the usual cast of crazy Australian wildlife, Janszoon tried to name Australia New Zealand or New Zealand, but people gave that to another place. By the way, New Zealand is a region in the Netherlands, or at least Zealand is. Anyways, Willem Janszoon was scared by Australia, so he fled to Indonesia. I wonder who he would inspire. One of the very obscure explorers Janszoon inspired was Pieter Nooitst. Nooitst was told by the Netherlands, oh, Pieter Nooitst, this Australia place is a little bit big, so how about you map the south and we'll force some other sailors to map the north? Deal? Pieter Nooitst was like, no. And then the Netherlands was like, if you don't, we'll hold your family hostage. And so he said, for sure, I'd love to. Pieter Nooitst then went about sailing around the south of Australia in what we now call a Great Australian Bight. No, not the kind where you bite something. It's like a way too shallow bay. And he sailed 1,100 miles. Pieter Nooitst then inspired another much more famous explorer to come to Australia. This Australian explorer was one who inspired the name of a current province today. This much more famous Dutch explorer was Abel Tasman. From November to December of 1642, Tasman circled Australia from the west coast until he ended up in the same place he started. Along the way, he passed an island that he named Van Diemen's Land. It would later be renamed after him as Tasmania. In 1644, Tasman returned to Australia just to look at its north coast. He then went to Indonesia to pursue a very fun hobby, which is called dyeing. The Dutch were then like, if we're exploring this place, how about we name it something like, I don't know, New Holland? And the name stuck for a long time. By the way, Holland only refers to 2 provinces of the Netherlands. Just call it the Netherlands. You're not calling the entire country just Holland. That's only 2 parts of it. Just call it the Netherlands. Anyways, that's enough of my naming rant. Hey Dutchies, do you smell that? It's a very odd smell. It's called the British. On April 20th, 1770, famed British overachiever explorer Captain James Cook sighted southeastern Australia. On August 13th, I don't know how it took him that long, Cook landed in what's now Sydney at the Botany Bay. He then claimed a good chunk of eastern Australia for the British as New South Wales. Today, this is a state, and people from it really have a big rivalry with a state to the south called Victoria, and its capital of Melbourne. On this day, January 26, 232 years ago, in 1788, if my calculations are correct, British sailor Arthur Phillip founded Sydney in New South Wales in Australia. That's right, Australians. Your National Day celebrates the founding of Sydney. So if you're from any other city in Australia, whether it be Brisbane, Cairns, the capital of the whole country, Canberra, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, or Hobart, or any other city, sorry. Also in 1778, the British decided they needed a pretty big prison. How big? Maybe a few acres? Nah, how about the size of a possible continent? And so, Australia, or what now is Australia, became a British penal colony for 150,000 prisoners, most of which were Irish, because let's just say the British don't always like the Irish. In 1817, Matthew Flinders, a British naval officer, thought the name New Holland sounded a bit too, well, Dutch, and the British don't always like the Dutch. So he thought this possible continent, depending on your definition of a continent, should be named something new. And so he looked at the Latin word Australis, meaning south, and he changed it to Australisa. Nah, that didn't sound good. How about you get rid of the S? Boom! There's the name Australia. And just like that, the name Australia was chosen for this new country or continent. Once again, you can call it a continent or a part of Oceania. I don't care. But anyways, the name stuck 200 years later. Moving on. After Australia's newly formed, very authoritarian colonial government had taken its roots, the Aboriginals didn't really like it. This led to conflicts, including the one I'm about to mention. On October 17, 1861, in central Queensland, north of New South Wales, including Cape York, a group of 26 British squatters, as they were called back then, were attacked by a group of Australian Aboriginals. 20 people as young as 6 months were slaughtered. This would lead to even more conflicts. Ever since the British arrived in Australia a long time ago, they didn't ever have a very good reputation and very good friendship with the Aboriginal natives, and so conflicts were inevitable. These conflicts would go until 1934, until a few acts were passed, but anyways, this conflict was known as the Australian Frontier Wars. That sounds like a really bad movie on Rotten Tomatoes. Anyways, by the end of the Australian Frontier Wars, 2,500 British settlers and 40,000 natives had died. In fact, the population of every Aboriginal Australian alive reached 500,000 in the early 1900s. The British just wanted them all dead. But luckily, they didn't die out. By 1880, Australia had gained more colonial divisions and colonies, including Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia, Victoria, New South Wales is already a colony, and Tasmania, which was its own weird thing up until now, with weird tigers that the British hated and caused to go extinct. Anyways, and there was also Victoria. Victoria was by far the most important of these colonies, and it, along with its capital, Melbourne, as I have been corrected many times, were treated as a special snowflake and were the center of culture and economics, which was important to the British because they like money, 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 and slavery. On January 1st, 1901, the mess of colonies that was Australia were unified and were upgraded to the Commonwealth of Australia. This is the point where most people say that Australia in its current form was founded, but in truth, it was still part of the British Empire, as it was also called the Dominion, keyword Dominion, meaning belonging to the British Empire, and it was technically still part of the British Empire, but in all senses, it acted like a sovereign country, even though it technically wasn't until very recently. I'll explain that later. And we have reached World War I. From 1914 to 1918, Australians were kind of forced to fight in World War I because they were part of the British Empire, which was slowly dying, but it was still around. Anyways, by the end of World War I, 62,000 Australians had died in it. But the next war, this war was devastating. Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the biggest and most brutal war in Australian history. I'm referring to the Great Emu War. That's right. In November of 1932, the farmers of Central Australia in that wasteland had had enough of the Australian national bird, the emus, which look like ostriches but aren't, destroying their crops. And so the farmers went to not the Department of Agriculture, but the Australian Department of Defense, and told them they wanted these emus gone. So the national government said, okay, we are going to declare actual war on the emus. And so it was. Do you think that a practical continent or a stupid bird species would win? If you guessed the birds, you'd be correct. This war against a bird species, which was being fought by a humongous country, which could be considered a continent, was ultimately a failure. And to this day, the emus still wreak havoc in Central Australia, just not as much because they invented better fences. And there's that fence that goes across Australia that's the world's longest. Moving on. Now back to wars fought by actual humans. From 1939 to 1945, during World War II, Australia's arm was once again twisted by the UK, their old colonial master, to fight, and they kind of had no choice to serve. And so 6 years later, in 1945, after Hitler went kaboom, 27,000 Australians had perished in this very bloody war. It left a very large mark on Australians today, and there are organizations which honor these fallen soldiers, like the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, the capital. And after World War II, Australia was now the top tourist destination and reached a population of 10 million, doubling its population. This is where all the Australian stereotypes come in, and this is where all the insane crowds and stupid tourists come from. Seriously, Australians know when there's stupid tourists when they don't put on sunscreen. A lot of tourists just think they can YOLO it, but nope, that sun is a deadly laser. Get my reference? Do you get my reference? I have mind-boggling news. Did you know Australia wasn't a full country until 1986? That's right. On March 3rd, 1986, Australia finally, 100%, without a doubt, for sure, no questions asked, became an official, sovereign, 100% representational country, as the UK took way too long to relinquish it. They love their colonies, and their colonies don't always love them. Finally, after 1986, Australia was its own country, which was thought to be long overdue. After this, in August of 2018, Scott Morrison, or as Aussies call him, ScoMo, was elected Prime Minister of Australia in the Liberal Party. No, the Liberal Party of Australia is not left-wing, it's actually right-wing. It's backwards, like many people call Australia. Although I don't think it's backwards, it's just a little crazy. And finally, throughout last year, 2020, the bad year, the area the size of Washington State in the USA. Washington State, not the District of Columbia. Washington State burned in the bushfires of the 2020 fire season. I know people were just memeing this to death, but this was serious. The size of Washington State burned. About 300 people died. That was a pretty crazy time. And with that, that was my history of Australia. Thank you all so much for watching this part of the video, as we have a bit more in this video to cover. Now for part 2 of this video, the national anthem. Without further ado, here is my cover of the Australian national anthem, Advance Australia Fair. Enjoy this part of the video, and then after that, I will tell you what video is coming up next. Thank you. And with that, thank you so much for watching my video on the history and the national anthem of the exotic land we call Australia. Whether it be the people, or the history, or the nature, or the land, or the landmarks, Australia is a fantastic country. I'd absolutely love to go, and I enjoyed making this video, and I hope you enjoyed watching. Thank you all so much for watching my video on Australia. This is a video I threw together over maybe 7.5 hours, and I hope it was worth it. Now, what video is coming up next? Why, it's coming out tomorrow, and it will be on one of, if not the greatest composers of all world history, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Tomorrow is his birthday, and I will be playing his most iconic song, whether you recognize the name or not, Ein kleine Nachtmusik, or Music of the Night. I promise you, you'll know exactly what song it is as soon as you hear it if you watch that video tomorrow. So yeah, it's not going to be a biography, because I am not going to put myself through making like a 15-minute video in one day. I need multiple days, so I'm just going to be playing a cover of his most famous song. So yeah, thank you all so much for watching. Hope you can stay tuned. If you like this video, then don't forget to give it a like, subscribe if you like, and thank you all so much for watching. Ah!